She stood in the corner, barefoot and trembling, her clothes torn, her face streaked with dust. People glanced, then looked away, some sneered, others whispered. "Why is she even here?" someone muttered. "Disgusting," another scoffed. A waiter waved her off like trash. "Go. You don't belong." She didn't say a word, just stood still, holding something small and worn in her hands, a photo, folded and creased. Around her, the room buzzed with laughter and music, but she was invisible, until the sharp echo of shoes cut through the noise. Everyone turned. A man walked in tailored suit, presence like thunder. He didn't speak to the crowd. He walked straight to her. The whispers grew louder, confused. He knelt, wiped the dust from her face, and held up the photo she carried. "She's mine," he said softly. Then louder, "She's my daughter." Silence. Every mocking face fell, because the girl they had pushed away was the one he had spent years searching for. And now, she had more than just a name. She had the most powerful man in the room standing by her side. Welcome to Heroes Unheard. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being a part of it. The Manhattan Elite Club stood like a monument to privilege on the Upper East Side, its towering glass facade reflecting the city lights in crystalline perfection. Tonight, the building hummed with the energy of New York's most powerful gathering, the annual Children's Future Foundation Gala, where billionaires and celebrities wrote million-dollar checks while sipping champagne that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Inside the opulent ballroom, crystal chandeliers cast golden light across marble floors so polished they looked like mirrors. Tables draped in silk held centerpieces of rare orchids flown in from Thailand that morning. The guest list read like a who's who of American wealth and influence, tech moguls who shaped global communication, real estate dynasties that owned Manhattan skylines, entertainment executives who controlled what the world watched, and politicians whose decisions moved markets with single statements. The evening's theme was particularly fitting: investing in tomorrow's leaders. Ironic, considering how quickly the assembled elite would judge anyone who didn't meet their standards of acceptable presentation. These were people who believed poverty was a choice, that success was simply a matter of proper breeding and education, that the homeless were invisible failures who had somehow chosen their circumstances. Security was discreet but absolute. Guards in expensive suits monitored every entrance, their earpieces crackling with updates about approved arrivals. The velvet ropes outside weren't just decorative, they were statements of exclusion, barriers that separated the worthy from the masses who could only dream of entering such rarefied air. Mrs. Vivian Blackwood, wife of a pharmaceutical billionaire, adjusted her diamond necklace as she surveyed the crowd with satisfaction. Everything was perfect. The right people wearing the right clothes, discussing the right topics. No disruptions, no uncomfortable reminders of the world beyond their golden bubble. "Charity work is so fulfilling," she murmured to her companion, Lady Catherine Windsor, whose family had been wealthy for so many generations they'd forgotten what it felt like to want for anything. "Writing checks to help the unfortunate makes one feel so purposeful." "Indeed," Lady Catherine agreed, her accent carrying the refined polish of British aristocracy. "Though of course, we must be careful about the types of children we support. Not all unfortunate circumstances are created equal, if you understand my meaning." They both understood perfectly. Their charity supported carefully vetted children from respectable families who had fallen on temporary hard times, never the truly desperate, never the ones who might make their donors uncomfortable with the reality of genuine suffering. The evening proceeded with clockwork precision. Speeches were delivered about changing young lives while servers in white gloves circulated with canapes that cost more per bite than many families spent on entire meals. The auction portion raised astronomical sums for programs that would help a carefully selected few while ignoring the masses who didn't meet the foundation's unspoken criteria for worthiness. It was during the champagne reception that followed the auction that the first security guard noticed something was wrong. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered commanding views of Central Park, he spotted a figure moving slowly across the manicured lawn outside. Someone who clearly didn't belong in this pristine landscape of wealth and privilege. "Control, we have an unidentified individual approaching the south entrance," he whispered into his microphone, watching as the figure drew closer to the building. Inside the ballroom, conversations continued in blissful ignorance of the approaching disruption. Mrs. Blackwood was explaining to a group of admirers how her latest charitable contribution would fund a scholarship program for deserving youth. While Lady Catherine nodded approvingly at the careful screening process that would ensure only the most appropriate candidates received assistance. "We simply cannot be too careful," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never questioned her right to determine who deserved help. "Some people, I'm afraid, are simply beyond redemption. Our resources must go to those who will use them properly." The other women murmured agreement, secure in their belief that their wealth gave them not just the power to help, but the wisdom to choose who was worthy of that help. They were discussing the importance of background checks when the first scream shattered their comfortable assumptions. She appeared in the main entrance like a ghost from another world, slipping past security during a shift change when attention was momentarily diverted. At first, the guests thought she was part of some elaborate performance. Surely no real homeless person could have penetrated their carefully guarded sanctuary. But as she stepped fully into the golden light of the ballroom, the horrible reality became undeniable. She was perhaps 16 years old, though the streets had aged her beyond her years. Her hair hung in tangled knots around a face that might have been beautiful if it weren't etched with exhaustion and hunger. Her clothes were layers of mismatched fabric, each piece telling a story of desperate scavenging from dumpsters and charity bins. Her feet were bare, soles blackened and hardened from months of concrete and asphalt. She walked with the careful gait of someone who had learned to test each step, to avoid the broken glass and sharp metal that littered the urban landscape she called home. In her dirt-stained hands, she clutched a crumpled envelope like it contained the most precious treasure in the world. The ballroom fell silent as 500 pairs of eyes focused on this impossible intrusion. Crystal glasses stopped halfway to lips. Conversations died mid-sentence. The comfortable bubble of wealth and privilege trembled as reality crashed through their carefully maintained barriers. "My God," whispered Mrs. Blackwood, her hand flying to her throat as if the girl's presence might somehow contaminate her. "How did she get in here?" "Security," Lady Catherine hissed, her refined accent sharpening with disgust. "Where is security? This is absolutely intolerable." The girl stood frozen in the center of the ballroom, overwhelmed by the sudden attention and the obvious hostility radiating from every corner of the room. She looked around desperately, searching for something or someone, her eyes wide with hope that was rapidly fading into fear. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying in the profound silence. "I'm looking for Richard Ashworth. I have a letter." Her words were cut off by a collective gasp of revulsion from the assembled elite. The idea that this homeless waif would dare speak the name of one of their most prominent members was beyond comprehension. "How dare you?" snapped Margaret Carlyle, a society matron whose husband owned half the commercial real estate in Manhattan. "You have no business being here, much less speaking about Mr. Ashworth." "Please," the girl tried again, holding up the envelope with trembling hands. "I just need to find him. The letter says." "The letter says nothing that matters here," interrupted Victoria Sterling, whose family had been among New York's elite for generations. "Security, remove this person immediately." But the security guards were already moving, their black suits cutting through the crowd like sharks sensing blood in the water. The girl saw them coming and backed away, her bare feet slipping slightly on the marble floor. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," she pleaded, her voice growing stronger with desperation. "I just need to find my—" "Your what?" laughed Helena Vanderbilt, her voice dripping with disdain. "Your drug dealer? Your pimp? People like you don't have business with people like us." The crowd began to close in around the girl, their expensive clothes and jewelry creating a glittering wall of rejection. They moved like a pack, unified in their disgust and determination to remove this uncomfortable reminder of poverty from their perfect evening. "Look at her," whispered Amanda Rothschild, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Diseased, probably. Drug-addicted, certainly. The smell alone is nauseating." "How did she even know about this event?" demanded Patricia Astor, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "She's probably casing the place for a robbery. These people are always scheming to take what doesn't belong to them." The girl's eyes filled with tears as the verbal assault continued. She clutched the envelope tighter, as if it might somehow protect her from the hatred surrounding her on all sides. The security guards were close now, their hands reaching out to grab her and drag her back to the streets where she belonged. "Please," she whispered one last time, her voice breaking with despair. "The letter is from my father. He said if I ever needed help, I should come here and find Richard Ashworth. He said." "Richard Ashworth doesn't associate with garbage," snarled Mrs. Blackwood, her face twisted with contempt. "And neither do we. Get out before you contaminate us all with whatever diseases you're carrying." The crowd pressed closer, their faces masks of disgust and superiority. They were enjoying this, taking pleasure in their power to humiliate and reject someone so far beneath their station. The girl was completely surrounded now, trapped in a circle of silk and diamonds and pure, refined cruelty. Just as the security guards reached for her, just as the crowd prepared to watch her be dragged away like refuse, the elevator doors at the far end of the ballroom opened with a soft chime that somehow cut through the noise like a blade through silk. Richard Ashworth stepped out of the elevator like a force of nature contained in human form. Tech visionary, real estate mogul, philanthropist, but those titles barely scratched the surface of his influence. In a room full of billionaires, he was the billionaire they all wanted to impress. When Richard Ashworth spoke, markets moved. When he made decisions, entire industries shifted. When he entered a room, even other titans of wealth and power paid attention. Tonight, however, he looked like a man who had just received the worst news of his life. His usually perfect composure was cracked, his expensive suit wrinkled as if he had dressed in haste. His eyes swept the ballroom with laser focus until they locked onto the scene unfolding in the center of the room, a homeless girl surrounded by a pack of well-dressed predators. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The security guards froze with their hands inches from the girl's shoulders. The crowd remained locked in their circle of condemnation, unaware that the entire dynamic of the evening was about to shift in ways they couldn't imagine. Then Ashworth moved, and his movement was like watching a glacier calve, slow, inevitable, and carrying the power to reshape everything in its path. He walked across the marble floor with measured steps that echoed in the sudden silence, each footfall seeming to count down to something momentous. "Stop," he said, and the single word carried such authority that the security guards immediately dropped their hands and stepped back. "Don't touch her." Mrs. Blackwood turned toward him with relief, assuming he would support their efforts to remove the unwelcome intruder. "Richard, thank goodness you're here. This vagrant somehow got past security, and we were just—" "I said don't touch her," Ashworth repeated, his voice cutting through her explanation like ice through silk. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as the assembled elite realized this wasn't playing out as they had expected. He reached the edge of the circle and the crowd parted before him automatically, their earlier unity dissolving in the face of his obvious displeasure. The girl looked up at him with eyes that were red from crying, her face streaked with tears that had carved clean paths through the dirt on her cheeks. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Then Ashworth knelt on the marble floor, his $1,000 suit touching the same surface that had been deemed too good for her bare feet. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, filled with a tenderness that made the watching crowd feel like intruders witnessing something sacred. "Sarah," he whispered, the name carrying decades of love and loss and desperate searching. "Oh, my beautiful girl. I've been looking for you everywhere." The girl, Sarah, dropped the envelope and threw herself into his arms, her sob echoing across the silent ballroom like a prayer finally answered. "Daddy," she cried, the word containing all the pain and hope and relief of a child who had been lost and was finally found. Ashworth held her like she might disappear if he let go, his own tears falling freely now as he pressed his face against her tangled hair. When he finally looked up at the crowd of wealthy spectators, his expression had transformed into something that made even the most powerful people in the room take involuntary steps backward. "This," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom, "is my daughter." The silence that followed was deafening. 500 faces went through identical transformations, confusion giving way to shock, shock melting into horror, horror crystallizing into the terrible understanding of what they had just done. These people who prided themselves on their intelligence, their sophistication, their ability to navigate complex social situations, had just spent 20 minutes humiliating and rejecting the daughter of the most powerful man in the room. Mrs. Blackwood's champagne glass slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering on the marble floor with a sound like breaking crystal bells. Lady Catherine's face had gone white beneath her carefully applied makeup. Margaret Carlyle looked like she might faint, while Victoria Sterling gripped her husband's arm so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Ashworth stood slowly, lifting Sarah in his arms like she was made of spun glass. She clung to him with the desperate intensity of someone who had thought she would never feel safe again, her bare feet dangling in the air that had recently been deemed too pure for her presence. "She's been missing for 4 months, he said, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent that made everyone in the room aware they were walking on the edge of a precipice. "Kidnapped from her boarding school in Switzerland. The ransom demands stopped coming 6 weeks ago. I've had investigators searching 3 continents. I've offered rewards that could fund small countries." He paused, looking around at the faces of people who had minutes earlier been competing to see who could express the most disgust at his daughter's appearance. She escaped 3 days ago and has been trying to get home ever since. She's been living on the streets of New York, hungry, scared, alone, while you people have been in here talking about helping disadvantaged children. The irony was not lost on anyone present. These same people who had spent the evening writing checks to help unfortunate youth had just tried to have a genuinely desperate child thrown out into the cold. She remembered this address from the letter I wrote her before she was taken, Ashworth continued, his voice growing harder with each word. A letter telling her that if she was ever in trouble, if she ever needed help, she should come here and find me. She walked 20 blocks in bare feet to get to this building tonight. Sarah lifted her head from her father's shoulder and looked around at the crowd with eyes that held no anger, only a sadness that seemed far too deep for someone so young. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear. I wasn't trying to steal anything, she said. I wasn't sick or on drugs. I was just trying to get home to my dad. The simple dignity in her words hit the assembled elite like physical blows. These people who had built their lives on their ability to judge character, to separate the worthy from the unworthy, had gotten it completely wrong. They had looked at a kidnapping victim and seen a criminal. They had looked at a lost child and seen a threat. Ashworth's gaze moved slowly across their faces, taking in every expression of shame and growing fear. He was memorizing each face, cataloging every person who had participated in his daughter's humiliation. In a room full of people whose fortunes and social standing depended on his goodwill, that attention felt like a death sentence. I want to thank you, he said, his voice carrying a politeness that was somehow more threatening than any display of anger would have been. You've helped me understand exactly who my true friends are, and more importantly, who they are not. Mrs. Blackwood stepped forward with trembling hands, her voice shaking as she tried to salvage what she could from the wreckage of the evening. Richard, please, we had no way of knowing. If you had just told us. Told you what? He asked, his eyebrows rising with what might have been genuine curiosity. That she was my daughter? That she was a human being who deserved basic kindness? Should that have mattered? The question hung in the air like smoke, exposing the fundamental cruelty that had driven their behavior. They hadn't rejected Sarah because they didn't know who she was. They had rejected her because they thought she was nobody important. She came to you for help, Ashworth continued, his voice growing stronger. A frightened, hungry child asked you for assistance, and your response was to mock her, insult her, and call security to throw her out. Not because she was dangerous, not because she was threatening anyone, but because she was poor. Lady Catherine tried to speak, her refined accent cracking under the weight of her desperation. Richard, surely you can understand our position. Security concerns, you know. We simply couldn't. Couldn't what? He interrupted. Couldn't show basic human decency to a child in need? Couldn't spare a moment of compassion for someone who was obviously desperate? Couldn't see past her appearance to recognize her humanity? He adjusted his hold on Sarah, who had been listening to this exchange with the wide-eyed attention of someone learning important lessons about the world and the people in it. I've learned something valuable tonight, Ashworth said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper but somehow carrying clearly to every corner of the ballroom. I've learned that all the money in the world can't buy character. All the breeding in the world can't instill basic kindness. All the education in the world can't teach someone to see a fellow human being in distress and respond with anything other than their most basic instincts. The security guards who had been preparing to drag Sarah away now stood at rigid attention, their faces carefully neutral as they witnessed their employer's complete dominance over a room full of people who were accustomed to dominating others. There will be consequences, Ashworth said simply. Business relationships will be reevaluated. Social invitations will be reconsidered. Charitable contributions will be redirected to organizations that actually care about helping people rather than just talking about it. He turned to leave, then paused and looked back at the crowd one final time. My daughter has spent 4 months being held by people who saw her only as a commodity, only as something to be used for their own purposes. Tonight, she discovered that the people I considered my peers are no different from her captors. They just wear better clothes while they're being cruel. Sarah looked up at her father's face, then turned to address the crowd herself. Her voice was quiet but carried the kind of moral authority that comes from genuine suffering survived with dignity intact. I forgive you, she said simply. But I hope you remember this feeling the next time you see someone who needs help. Ashworth carried his daughter toward the elevator, leaving behind a ballroom full of the most powerful people in New York who suddenly felt very small and very powerless. The silence stretched long after the elevator doors closed, broken only by the sound of Mrs. Blackwood quietly sobbing into her handkerchief. In the weeks that followed, the social landscape of New York's elite shifted dramatically. Ashworth's businesses pulled out of partnerships, his foundation redirected millions in funding, and his social circle contracted to include only those who had either not been present that night or had shown some measure of kindness to his daughter. Sarah returned to school, but with a new understanding of human nature that no classroom could have provided. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen the worst of humanity and chosen to respond with grace. The Children's Future Foundation found itself with a drastically reduced donor base, as Ashworth's influence spread and others began to question the true values of an organization that would reject the very children it claimed to want to help. And in the marble-floored ballroom of the Manhattan Elite Club, they installed a small plaque near the entrance. It read simply, "Every person who enters here carries the full weight of human dignity. Judge accordingly." It was paid for by Richard Ashworth, and served as a daily reminder to all who pass that wealth and status mean nothing if they are not accompanied by basic human decency. This story was brought to you by Heroes Unheard. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how you remember them. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.